It's a lazy day for me. Just sitting in front of my fireplace on this crisp October evening. Window open, nice cool fresh breeze rolling in. It really got me thinking. There's this story, true story actually, happened right here in my hometown. I'd like to share it with y'all. So if you find a cozy place to sit or lay, I'll tell you a story that I've never told anyone to this day. Let me grab my tea and we'll begin. It was late summer in charming Indiana. The year was 1996. Our town was quiet, peaceful, and well, charming, hence the name. It was my favorite time of year, late summer, early fall. This is when the chaos of the summer would start to die down, the bugs would die, animals started to hibernate, a crisp, fresh feeling of wind in the air night, maybe a bit eerie at times, but I liked it that way. We lived in a town of 689 people, give or take a few. There were probably a few more since this was coming from the 1994 census. I've watched a couple new families move into the area. Charming was not too small of a town, but definitely not big city living. Our main street consisted of only a handful of businesses, a church, a hair salon, 2 bars, one of them was a bar and grill, and of course a post office and a small supermarket. We did have a gas station on the far end of Main Street and the local community center. This building would bring our residents together for all kinds of activities. For an older, smaller town, we were a fun little town. Our teens and young adults still dragged Maine with their mommy and daddy souped up vehicles or loaded down cargo vans. It was really something. Lots of engines howling, music blaring and laughter, cat calling coming from the windows out to anyone who was walking the streets. I forgot to mention we had one of those old-time drive-up movie places, where you park outside and watch a movie and your food and drink order would be brought right to your window. This place was a highlight in our town. It was packed every weekend. I suppose I'll skip forward a bit and get to the point. About a year later, September of 97, our town started to experience a small crime wave. It was really strange. We all knew each other, and if we didn't, our best friends knew the ones that we didn't. People's vehicles and houses were getting broken into. There was vandalism on the local community center walls and front door. Just shameful. People destroying things and stealing. We didn't have our own police station, but the nearest town, Dawson, did. Dawson was only about 14 miles away. The Dawson PD started to patrol nightly through charming streets. Our mayor, Mr. Jack Reynolds, called a city meeting and ordered the town to have a curfew. Nobody allowed out past 10 p.m. without prior business consent or an emergency situation. One of the newer families that moved to Charming a little over a year ago offered to start a group called the Neighborhood Crime Watch. Henry and a couple of his neighbors decided to form this group, and they do evening walk-arounds, making sure the town was safe. It really was a great idea. I believe Henry and his family, the Petersons, moved here from New Hampshire. As for a reason why, well, I never asked. Henry, his wife Sarah, and their twin boys Cole and Callan, who were 14, settled into Charming pretty well. They seemed like a normal, friendly family. They often helped with community activities, so it was only natural that Henry volunteered for the Neighborhood Crime Watch. It was now early October, and the crimes were still happening, and honestly, they seemed to be getting worse. The residents of Charming started double-locking doors and windows, and some folks even got themselves a guard dog. This was a new thing for Charming. We always left our doors unlocked and slept with our windows open. Who doesn't love the cool night breeze when you sleep? The crimes were intensifying. People were getting mugged and assaulted. There were even 2 attempted kidnappings in Charming. We all started to wonder if a bad group of teens or adults from Dawson were coming over and stirring up trouble. After all, Dawson was a bigger city with about 7,000 people. Not huge, but definitely way bigger than our 700 folks. Henry and his group reported multiple times that when they did the walk around, they haven't seen anything suspicious. which means between the hours of 1 a.m. and 6 a.m., these crimes are being committed. By who? We still don't know. 2 weeks passed, and it was getting close to Halloween. The mayor, Mr. Reynolds, announced that trick-or-treating was allowed only until 10 p.m., and you must be accompanied by an adult, 18 or older. Make sure to check your candy at the end of the night, he added. The whole town was apprehensive and untrusting of their own neighbors and friends. Everyone was confused and constantly wondering who could be doing this. Now, this is where the story really gets interesting. It's Halloween and the streets are filled with people, kids in all kinds of crazy costumes. Ghostface from that movie Scream was the most popular Halloween costume at that time. After all, Scream 2 had just hit the big screens. It was really creepy not knowing who was underneath the cloak and mask. A group of 3 friends, Jason, Kyle, and Ellie, and of course Ellie's big brother Mike, were out trick-or-treating. Mike was 18 and he had to tag along, mayor's rules and all. They decided to head over to the rich part of town, down over on Smith Avenue, right next to the beautiful creek that runs through Charming. As they were climbing the steps to Mr. and Mrs. Lumen's place, the big, gorgeous Victorian house, Ellie noticed something out of the corner of her eye. Next to Mr. and Mrs. Lumen's house was a creek in a forested area. Ellie, who was 13, with hair as bright as the sun, started to walk back down the steps and over towards the tree row. Her big brother Mike asked her what she was doing, and she said, "I seen something, hang on." Jason and Kyle went on ahead and rang the doorbell. When Mr. Lumen answered the door, the boys yelled, "Trick or treat!" Not 5 seconds later, Ellie let out the most shrill scream. Mike and the 2 boys ran over to where Ellie was. Ellie was standing still with her gaze focused and her hands covering her face. When they got to her, they seen what she was looking at. They yelled, "Oh my God, who is that? What the hell happened here?" said Mike. Ellie had stumbled upon a dead body in the tree row, right down by the creek's edge. The body was that of a woman, maybe in her 30s or 40s. The Dawson Police Department was called immediately. Mike and the kids waited on Mr. and Mrs. Lumen's steps to give their testimonies to the police. The Lumens brought out some hot tea to soothe the kids while they were waiting. Poor kids, and poor Ellie. This surely will scar her for life. The trauma that she has endured is just terrible. 2 days went by, and the headline in the paper read, "Mysterious Woman Dead in Charming." Ellie wasn't talking. I suppose she was still in shock. The whole area behind Mr. and Mrs. Lumen's place was under crime scene investigation. It was taped off with that yellow caution tape. The detectives and police officers scoured the area looking for clues. They left no stone unturned. They even questioned the little old couple, the Lumens, but like the rest of us, they knew nothing. Mr. and Mrs. Lumen are natives to Charming. Both of them are in their early 70s. They were born right over in Dawson's Hospital and come to Charming with their families when they were just babies. Mr. Lumen was a doctor for many years. He ran a small practice from his home. Mrs. Lumen was a substitute teacher, but mostly a housewife. Oh, she loved her life in Charming. Everyone knew the Lumens and loved them. Mr. Lumen had been retired for many years now, but everyone still called him Doc. I think a week had passed, and the article in the paper about the deceased mysterious woman had listed a cause of death. Her throat was slit almost from ear to ear. Some of her hair was cut, and her fingernails clipped real short. This woman was almost drained completely of her blood. This might be strange to say, but even in the article in the paper, the writer commented how beautiful this woman was, even in death. The coroner said she couldn't have been dead more than 24 hours. He said it looked like a puncture mark on her neck, but that it was also slit by something extremely sharp. Well, the puncture mark could have come from a snake or a spider bite as she laid there in the woods. It's hard to say. The coroner said the toxicology report wouldn't be back for a week yet. The whole town was in an uproar. They were scared and furious, as we all should be. This time of year, the creek was deeper than normal. The creek behind the Lumens place stretched on for miles. The detectives decided to call in the bigwigs and search and drag the creek. This search took a lot of manpower and a lot of time. Meanwhile, it's almost Thanksgiving, and everyone's afraid to come out of their home. Afraid of their own shadows, really. I thought to myself, Charming used to be a beautiful, safe little haven. What is happening? A week later, this all was announced on the news. Our town was famous for a murder. Toxicology report came back on our Jane Doe. They detected thallium in her blood, a large quantity. And for those of you who don't know what thallium is, it's a poison. It's hard to detect and it kills quickly. If someone poisoned her, why did they slit her throat too? This murder didn't make any sense, not that any murder really does. They drugged the creek and walked through the woods for over 2 weeks. Finally, they found something. Actually, they found a lot. Detective Bryson found more bodies, 3 more so far. They still had about half a mile of land and creek to search. Oh dear, we have a serial killer on our hands. The other 3 victims were 2 females and 1 male, all between 20 and 40 years of age. They were killed the very same way as our first Jane Doe. The detective and the coroner were confused on several things. Thallium hasn't been made or distributed since 1986. It's 1997. Does someone know how to make it? Do they have a large quantity stashed? Also, all 4 of the victims were drained almost completely of their blood. So where is all the blood? Detective Bryson said. Time went on, and this was still an open case and investigation. It was almost 2 months since we found Jane Doe on Halloween. Still no clues as to who is doing this or why. It was hard to get into the Christmas spirit, but our mayor was good at bringing our little town together. We had a Christmas Eve light show and Christmas caroling. We had a Christmas dance for the community at the hall. And then the next morning for Christmas Day we had a parade. It was absolutely lovely. It helped us all relax a little bit and find the joy for the holiday. I thought after the new year started, this nightmare would just go away and Charming would return to his old peaceful self. I was wrong. January 4th, 1998, crisp, snowy morning, and another body was found. This time, a male in his 40s in an abandoned house here in Charming. None of these victims were residents of Charming, so where are they coming from? Has nobody claimed them? Did they not have family or friends? How long have they been missing? So we now have 5 bodies. All victims were killed in the same manner, same details. This is definitely being done by the same person or persons. As Detective Bryson continued to go over case files, Bryson ended up going to close-by towns and cities to investigate. He thought it'd be best to see if there were missing persons from close by. When Detective Bryson pulled into Mesa PD, a town about an hour south of Dawson, he spoke with Chief Williams, asking about missing persons and any unsolved murders that would be similar to the cases he was working on. Chief Williams pulled open the middle and top file cabinet's drawers and grabbed a chunk of files from each drawer. Detective Bryson's eyes got real big and his jaw just dropped. Is that all? He said, trying to be a bit humorous in an unfortunate situation. Together, both the detective and chief started thumbing through files and organized the ones very similar to the 5 deceased victims in his current case. It came as quite a shock when they both realized that there are many cases identical to what Detective Bryson is dealing with. In fact, there are close to 100 victims who have met an early death with the same details as his 5 victims. All between the ages of 20 and 50, nobody younger, nobody older. They were given a large dose of thallium poison and slit ear to ear and almost completely drained of their blood. These cold case files date back as far as 40 years ago. 41 years ago to be exact, said Chief Williams. First John Doe was found in the creek back in 1957. We couldn't find any family or friends or where he came from. It's like he just showed up, dead. Detective Brasson stood up and walked circles in the room. So if this is the same person or persons, they would have to be in the 60s or 70s. Unless they started killing as a child, whispered Chief. Chief Williams went to the evidence room to pull case file number 10293. This was the third body found back in 1960, a female, 25 at most. Long, gorgeous red hair, beautiful skin, and long fingernails. We did find a bit of blood under her nail bed, but couldn't trace it to anybody in the system. You see, back then, DNA analysis and that sort of thing wasn't around. But as of the late 80s, it became available. It's now 1998. So do we have any collected blood or fingerprints we could run through the database? Asked Detective Bryson. Now just hold on there, son, said Chief Williams, who was a heavy-set guy in his mid-60s, still going hard at it. He was always on the side of the law. I need to show you something. He went into the box that contained files for case number 10293. He pulled out a small plastic package. It contained a ring, a woman's ring, size 4. Odd-looking, with a black stone. Chief Williams handed the ring packet to Detective Bryson. He looked at it for a long minute. He scratched his head. I know I've seen this ring before. Was it the victim's? No, said Chief Williams. We believe it was left behind by the killer. So the killer is a woman? We think so, yes, said Chief. This doesn't make any sense. But when I interviewed a little old couple on the south side of Charmin right by the creek, their names Mr. and Mrs. Lumen, Mrs. Lumen was wearing earrings that matched this ring perfectly. Maybe it's a set? But why or how is she connected? We all know it's not the Lumens out here killing people. They're the nicest, sweetest old couple, been around Charmin forever. It's worth looking into, exclaimed Chief Williams. Detective Bryson left instantly. On his drive back to Charming that afternoon, he called Mr. and Mrs. Lumen, hoping he could have a word with them. He needed to ask just a few more questions. He spoke with Mrs. Lumen, and she said, Sure thing, we love company. I'll put the tea on and see you when you get here. Chief Williams had decided to follow Detective Bryson into Charming to ask some questions of his own. He was a bit behind, though, as he needed to stop home first to check on his wife Nona, who was ill in bed. Detective Bryson walked up the steps to the Lumen's residence and looked around. Creepy house, he whispered. Mrs. Lumen opened the door before he could even knock. This startled him a bit. I've been expecting you, said Mrs. Lumen. Won't you come in? I've made us some nice tea. Thank you, ma'am. I just need to ask a few questions and then I'll be on my way. Is your husband here, Mrs. Lumen? He's actually out, but I'm expecting him soon. The two sat and drank tea for a few minutes, while Mrs. Lumen presumed to small talk about weather. It's awfully warm for spring, isn't it? Detective Bryson had a hard time answering. He felt as if he swallowed his tongue. He was a bit dizzy, and Mrs. Lumen noticed he was sweating. Are you okay, dear? You look unwell. Detective Bryson started to say something, and then he hit the floor. As he laid there, Mrs. Lumen rolled him over onto his back. Mr. Lumen came inside from the back door with his medical bag in hand. He knelt down next to the detective to feel for a pulse. He's still alive, Ma, but barely. Mr. Lumen, or Doc as we all knew him, opened up his medical bag and pulled out a small scalpel. As he tilted Detective Bryson's head back to line up the scalpel under the ear, Chief Williams busted through the door with his gun drawn. Mr. Lumen was starting to cut, so Chief shot him with his Glock 22. He hit Mr. Lumen right in the heart. He fell back and didn't move. Mrs. Lumen ran the minute Chief Williams entered the home. Williams walked over with his pistol still drawn to see if Lumen was dead. He sure looked dead. Blood pooling out of his body underneath him. He knelt down to check for a pulse on Detective Bryson. There was a weak pulse. Chief Williams called for an ambulance and backup. Backup arrived within 10 minutes, and the ambulance was there in 6. The police officers and Chief Williams searched the home but didn't have any luck finding Mrs. Lumen. It's like she vanished. Detective Bryson was taken by ambulance to the Dawson City Hospital. Mr. Lumen was also taken by ambulance in a body bag to the morgue. Mr. Lumen was a tall, skinny man, 6'3", 180 pounds. He wore glasses. He surprisingly had a lot of hair for being in his 70s. Most men are balding or completely bald by then. When coroner David Lane undressed Mr. Lumen for the autopsy, he noticed a lot of scars and a well-toned body. Chief Williams showed up and David asked him, "Are you sure Mr. Lumen was in his 70s? "Well, not positive, but they told us before that they both were in their early 70s. Coroner said, "Come here for a minute." Chief Williams slowly walked over. "Does this look like the body of a 70-year-old man to you?" Chief Williams stared in confusion. "Well, he don't look but 30. How in the world is this possible? Did they lie about their age? They look like the sweet little elderly couple that everyone knows and loves." Chief Williams leaned down to look closer at Mr. Lumen and said, "Who or what are you?" The coroner, David, kept on with his autopsy, while Chief Williams went upstairs to check on Detective Bryson. Bryson was in a coma. "He was poisoned," said the nurse, who pulled up his covers. Chief Williams asked her, "Is he going to make it?" "Well, we gave him the antidote after pumping his stomach, so now all we can do is wait and pray." Chief Williams went home to his wife Nona, who had been sick with a flu bug for the past few days. He was too tired and too stressed for small talk or food, so he laid next to her and fell asleep. About 2:30 a.m., Chief Williams' phone rang. He picked it up. "Chief Williams here." "Hello, Chief Williams? This is David Lane from the coroner's office. I'm going to need you to come down here to the hospital immediately. We found something, and you need to see it." "On my way," said the chief. Chief Williams poured a quick cup of cold coffee into his thermos. He kissed Nona on the forehead and went on his way. He got to the hospital rather quickly. David met him at the door, and they walked down the stairs to the morgue. They entered the room with Mr. Lumen up on the metal slab. He was cut open for his autopsy. David pointed to Lumen's hip that had now been cut open. Chief Williams said, "What is that?" "Well, I noticed a pretty big scar on Mr. Lumen's hip. It was bigger than a golf ball. I decided to cut into it, and when I did, discovered this." David slowly reaches for a small metal tray and shows it to the chief. "What is that? Is that a ball?" "It's a musket ball," said David. "Musket ball? Like a pellet shot from a musket?" "Yes, exactly," exclaimed David. Mr. Lumen was shot in the hip by a musket. The musket ball has remained in his hip this entire time. "This doesn't make any sense," said the chief. "No, it really doesn't. Muskets were used in the 16th, 17th, and even the 18th century," said David. "So how did one of these end up in the deceased?" "I would say he was shot by a musket back in 1770s, and it's remained there ever since." "Wait, what?" said Chief Williams. "That would make Mr. Lumen centuries old." "Precisely," said David. "You see, I ran blood tests, liver tests, and looked at Lumen's cells underneath the microscope. He doesn't possess the enzymes or cells or anything that shows active aging. He isn't aging. Whatever age he really is, he hasn't aged since then." Chief Williams scratched his head and brushed and held the back of his neck. "Is he a vampire? Are we dealing with the goddamn vampire?" No, vampires don't exist," said David. "Well, how does this man still exist, centuries later after being shot by a damn musket?" "I can't tell you that. I don't have the answers." David pulls a bottle of scotch out of his drawer and takes a much-needed pull from the bottle. Chief Williams then asked for a shot. He opens his thermos and pours some in. I'm gonna need this. It's a couple weeks later, end of May. Detective Bryson is finally awake from his coma, and he's asking to see Chief Williams. Chief Williams heads to the hospital immediately to see Bryson. The minute he walks through the door, Detective Bryson says, "It was the tea." "Yes, it was. Mrs. Lumen poisoned you with thallium." "How did I get here?" "I followed you that night. I wanted to ask the Lumen some questions of my own. I walked in right as Mr. Lumen was going to cut you." "There's a lot to this story, Bryson. I need to fill you in when you're ready." "I'm ready. What the hell happened?" "Well, we found out the Lumens are not as old as they say they are." "I knew they didn't look 70s. "How old?" Bryson asked. Much older." "Older?" said Detective Bryson. "They didn't look a day over 40. Sure, they dressed older. Sure didn't look it." Chief Williams continued to fill Bryson in on the whole crazy story. Detective Bryson was in disbelief, a little shock, actually. Nobody could make sense of how Mr. and Mrs. Lumen were here all this time. Are they immortals? Well, no. Mr. Lumen was shot and killed. We still don't have any word on Mrs. Lumen. She's gone, vanished. Detective Bryson made a full recovery and went back home to Dawson. The folks of Charming were all still in shock. They couldn't believe that sweet, dear Mr. and Mrs. Lumen had anything to do with all those murders. Of course, a lot of details was kept from the public for safety reasons. Mayor Reynolds announced that the old Lumen place would be torn down for good. He wanted the good citizens of Charming to not be reminded daily of the evil in this world. Early June, that big, beautiful Victorian mansion that held so many hellish secrets was destroyed. The people of Charming celebrated, and for the most part were able to go about life again and get some normalcy back. Except for Ellie, sweet little Ellie who stumbled upon the first Jane Doe killed by the Lumens. She was scarred for life. Never the same. Hell, her family took her and moved her out of here some 25 years ago. I believe they moved to Mississippi. Sleepy little town called Renfield. Population of 1,200 people or so. Ellie's family changed her name and everything. Ellie was about to turn 39 next month in July. She actually turned out, well, considering the trauma she endured as a child, she was pretty well. Ellie, or whatever they call her now, is married, and she has her realtor's license. Renfield is a lovely little town, full of old, beautiful houses. Ellie, or Laura as they call her now, went for a drive to check out houses in her town. She spotted the most beautiful Victorian mansion over on Shady Lane. The whole neighborhood was full of gorgeous homes. Laura got out of her car and walked up the walk to the big front door. It was a big wooden door with a beautiful window way at the top. This place must have 15-foot ceilings, she thought. Laura knocked on the door using the brass knocker. She could hear it echo on the inside. A minute had passed, and a middle-aged woman, maybe 40, 45, answered the door. She was lovely. The woman said, "Hello, can I help you?" Laura gave her a business card and asked if she was interested in selling the home. The woman said, "Why, actually, yes. I've been thinking about moving. Won't you come in, please? I can make us some tea." "That would be lovely," said Laura. The woman introduced herself as Tabitha and shook hands with Laura. She said after our tea and talk, "I can give you a tour if you'd like." "I would love that. Thank you, Tabitha." Tabitha called from the kitchen. "1 sugar or 2?" Laura said. "1 for me, please." Tabitha met Laura out in the living room to discuss the house and numbers and all that. Tabitha handed Laura a cup of tea from a beautiful silver platter. It looked centuries old. Laura thanked her and took 2 big sips of her tea. "This is delicious," she said. "Thank you. I use herbs and a special ingredient, a little bit of honey and lemon too, of course." Laura took 2 more big sips of her tea and asked Tabitha when she moved in. "Oh, I haven't been here long, really. Would you like some more tea, Ellie? What did you say? Why did you call me that name? Said Laura. Nobody knows my real name around here. I haven't been Ellie since I was 13. My name is Laura. Why did you call me that name? Laura started to feel sweaty and dizzy. Did you think I would forget about you, Ellie? I'm Mrs. Lumen, from Charming. Tabitha smiled real big at Ellie. Ellie looked up with blurred vision. She panicked when she realized Tabitha put something in the tea. No, 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 Laura screamed. This isn't real. How can you still be alive? Well, you see, my dear, we have had a ritual in my family for centuries. A blood ritual. It's how I've stayed young and vibrant all this time. Centuries of secrets. There's just so much. But enough of that. More tea, dear? Please, let me go. Are you going to kill me? It's too late, said Mrs. Lumen. This will only hurt a little.